I learned 3 things the day I almost went to jail for practicing medicine without a license. First, volunteer firefighters in rural Pennsylvania exist in a legal gray zone nobody understands until it's too late. Second, some people will weaponize any rule they can find when they feel slighted. And third, karma works faster than you'd think when someone messes with emergency services. My name is Ryan Zimmerman, and I'd been volunteering with the Meadowbrook Fire Company for 6 years when everything went sideways. At 34, I worked as an electrician during the day and spent my evenings either at the firehouse or responding to calls. The station served a cluster of small communities about 40 minutes outside Pittsburgh, including the uppity planned neighborhood where I'd made the mistake of buying a house 2 years earlier. Sunset Ridge Estates. The development sprawled across 200 acres of former farmland, all cookie-cutter colonials painted in approved shades of beige and gray, with manicured lawns and streets named after trees that had been bulldozed to make room for the houses. When my wife left me and took half of everything, I'd needed affordable, and Sunset Ridge fit the bill. The homeowners association seemed like a minor annoyance at worst. Monthly fees of $75 bought you access to a mediocre pool, a playground, and the privilege of having someone inspect your property for code violations every quarter. I should have known better when I met Patricia Chambers at my first HOA meeting. She was 52, with that specific haircut that screamed, "I'd like to speak to your manager," and a voice that could strip paint off a fence. As president of the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA board, Patricia took her role with the seriousness of someone commanding nuclear submarines rather than arguing about fence heights and mailbox colors. "Mr. Zimmerman," she'd said that first night, eyeing the volunteer firefighter logo on my jacket, "I trust you'll park that emergency vehicle somewhere appropriate. We have standards about commercial vehicles in driveways." "It's my personal truck with emergency lights," I'd explained. "State law allows volunteer firefighters to have them for responding to calls." Her smile had all the warmth of a January morning. "We'll see about that." For 2 years, we'd maintained an uneasy truce. I kept my truck in the garage when possible, responded to my pager without fanfare, and mostly avoided HOA social functions. Patricia occasionally sent me violation notices for minor infractions like my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall or leaving my trash cans visible from the street 15 minutes past collection time. I paid the fines, usually $25 here and there, and moved on with my life. The real trouble started in March, when the HOA board unanimously voted to assess a special levy of $300 per household for upgrades to the community center. According to the elaborate presentation Patricia delivered at the monthly meeting, the building needed new siding, updated fixtures in the bathrooms, and a complete renovation of the kitchen that nobody used. "This is an investment in our community," Patricia announced, clicking through PowerPoint slides that looked like they'd taken weeks to prepare. "Property values depend on maintaining our facilities to the highest standards." I raised my hand from the back of the room. About 30 other homeowners sat scattered among the folding chairs, most looking resigned or bored. "Yes, Mr. Zimmerman." Patricia's tone suggested she'd expected this. "I'm just wondering why this needs to be a special assessment," I said. "Our regular dues are supposed to cover maintenance." "What happened to that budget?" Several heads turned, interested now. Patricia's expression hardened. "The board voted to allocate those funds toward other priorities. This assessment was approved according to our bylaws, which state that special assessments over $200 require a vote from the general membership," I countered. I'd actually read the bylaws after the third violation notice. Not just the board. The room got very quiet. Patricia's face flushed red, and the other 4 board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats at the front table. That provision, Patricia said slowly, applies only to emergency assessments. This is a planned improvement. That's not what the bylaws say. Section 12, paragraph 4. Want me to read it? I'd printed the relevant pages and held them up. A woman named Susan near the front actually stood to look over my shoulder at the document. He's right, Susan said. It says any special assessment over 200 requires a membership vote. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Patricia tried to maintain order, but too many homeowners had started pulling up the bylaws on their phones. After 40 minutes of heated discussion, the board reluctantly agreed to table the assessment until the next meeting, where a proper vote would be held. I thought I'd won. What I'd actually done was declare war. The first violation notice arrived 3 days later. My house number wasn't clearly visible from the street. Fine, $50. The second came that weekend. Decorative rocks in my front garden weren't natural earth tones as required by community standards. Fine, $75. By the end of the month, I'd received 8 separate violation notices totaling $430. I contested every single one, which the bylaws allowed. Each contest required a hearing before the board, scheduled at Patricia's convenience, which meant I spent 3 evenings in April sitting in that community center while she and her cronies solemnly reviewed photographs of my slightly too tall fence post or the unauthorized wind chimes hanging from my porch. They upheld every violation. When I still refused to pay, citing their questionable legitimacy, Patricia sent a certified letter informing me that my HOA voting privileges were suspended until all outstanding fines were resolved. Furthermore, I was now accruing late fees of $10 per day on the unpaid balance. This is insane, I told my buddy Jake Martinez, who also volunteered at the firehouse. We were washing one of the engines after a small brush fire call. She's literally inventing violations because I questioned her authority. Jake, who was fortunate enough to live outside any HOA jurisdiction, shook his head. Can she actually do that? Suspend your voting rights? According to the bylaws, yeah. Members in arrears can be suspended from certain privileges. I scrubbed at a stubborn spot of ash. But the violations themselves are garbage. She measured my grass with a ruler. Who does that? Someone with too much time and not enough purpose, Jake said. You gonna pay? Hell no. It's the principle of the thing. Famous last words. In May, Patricia escalated. I came home from a particularly grueling electrical job to find a new certified letter waiting. This one informed me that, due to my continued violation of community standards and refusal to pay legitimate fines, now totaling over $800 with late fees, the HOA board was imposing sanctions. Effective immediately, I was barred from using any community facilities, including the pool and playground, which didn't bother me since I never used them anyway. Then I got to the second page. The HOA was also formally requesting that I cease using my property as a base for commercial emergency services operations, citing noise complaints about my pager going off at all hours and the disruption caused by my frequent comings and goings at irregular times. They wanted me to stop volunteering as a firefighter. I read the letter 3 times, certain I'd misunderstood. But no, there it was in black and white. Patricia had somehow twisted my volunteer service into a commercial operation and was demanding I stop responding to calls from my home address. They can't do that, Chief Morrison said when I showed him the letter at the firehouse the next evening. Tom Morrison had run the Meadowbrook Fire Company for 15 years and had seen his share of absurdity, but this clearly tested his limits. "You're a volunteer. There's no commercial aspect. And state law specifically protects volunteer firefighters from this kind of harassment." "Can we fight it?" I asked. "Absolutely. I'll have our lawyer send them a letter." Tom studied the HOA notice again. "Though I've got to say, Ryan, this woman sounds like a piece of work." "What exactly did you do to piss her off?" I read the bylaws. Tom laughed, but his expression stayed serious. "Look, legally they don't have a leg to stand on, but HOAs can make your life miserable even when they're wrong. You prepared for that fight." I thought about backing down. I could just pay the ridiculous fines, keep my head down, maybe even apologize to Patricia for embarrassing her at the meeting. The path of least resistance beckoned invitingly. Then my pager went off. Structure fire, residential, just outside Meadowbrook proper. Tom and I both jumped into action, and 20 minutes later I was helping carry an elderly man out of his smoke-filled bedroom while flames consumed his kitchen. The man survived. His house didn't, but he survived because we got there fast enough. That's when I knew I couldn't stop. This wasn't about pride or principle anymore. People's lives depended on having enough volunteers to respond quickly. "I'll deal with whatever Patricia throws at me," I told Tom afterward, still smelling of smoke despite showering at the station. "I'm not quitting." The fire company's lawyer, a woman named Jennifer Park, who volunteered her services pro bono, sent a strongly worded letter to the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA board. It explained in detail why their demands were illegal, cited the relevant Pennsylvania statutes protecting volunteer emergency responders, and suggested they withdraw their sanctions immediately to avoid potential litigation. Patricia's response came not to me, but to the fire company. She filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming that Meadowbrook Fire Company was operating improperly by allowing volunteers to respond from residential areas within HOA communities. She argued that our operations violated noise ordinances and community peace regulations. The county fire marshal, a perpetually exhausted man named Bob Chen, had to investigate. He showed up at the station on a Tuesday afternoon looking apologetic. "This is the stupidest complaint I've ever received," Bob said, flipping through the paperwork, "but I have to follow protocol." "You know how it is." "What's she claiming exactly?" Tom asked. "That your volunteers create a public nuisance when responding from residential neighborhoods." Specifically, she's citing, Bob checked his notes, excessive noise from emergency pagers, dangerous driving conditions from emergency vehicles, and unauthorized use of residential property for commercial purposes. "It's volunteer work," I said. "There's nothing commercial about it." "I know that." "You know that." "Hell, a reasonably intelligent golden retriever would know that." Bob rubbed his temples. "But she's filed a formal complaint, so I need to do an investigation. Talk to some neighbors, review your response protocols, make sure everything's by the book. It'll take a few weeks." "And in the meantime," Tom asked. "Ryan can keep responding to calls. Nothing changes operationally." But Bob looked uncomfortable. "You might want to avoid any contact with this HOA president. Don't give her more ammunition." That proved difficult when Patricia lived 4 houses down from me on the same street. I started seeing her everywhere. She'd be getting her mail when I pulled into my driveway. She'd be power walking past my house with her phone conspicuously raised, like she was filming. Twice I caught her in my yard with a measuring tape, checking the height of my hedge against community standards. "This is harassment," I told Jake after the hedge incident. "Can I call the cops? She's measuring plants on community property." Jake pointed out. Technically, the HOA owns like 2 feet into everyone's lawn per your deed restrictions. She's probably within her rights. I hate this neighborhood. So move. Can't afford to. Not yet anyway. The market's terrible right now and I'd take a loss. The situation festered through May and into early June. Bob Chen completed his investigation and, as expected, found no merit to Patricia's complaints. He issued a formal letter clearing both me and the fire company of any wrongdoing. I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia thought otherwise. At the June HOA meeting, which I attended specifically to vote against the special assessment, Patricia announced a new community rule. Effective immediately, residents who use their property for outside emergency services work would be required to pay an additional monthly fee of $100 to cover increased insurance costs and community impact mitigation. You can't charge people for volunteering, I said immediately. We're not charging you for volunteering, Patricia replied sweetly. We're charging for the commercial use of residential property. If you want to operate a business from your home, there's a fee. That's standard. It's not a business. The fire marshal already cleared this. The fire marshal reviewed county regulations. He has no jurisdiction over HOA rules. Patricia smiled. The board voted unanimously to implement this fee structure. It's entirely within our authority to manage community expenses. This is targeted harassment, Susan, the woman who'd backed me up in March, said from her seat. You're creating a rule to punish Ryan specifically. The rule applies to all residents equally, Patricia said. If anyone else decides to run a business from their home requiring emergency vehicle access, they'll pay the same fee. Nobody else fits that description. Then I suppose the impact will be minimal. Patricia moved to the next agenda item before I could respond. I consulted with Jennifer Park again. Her assessment wasn't encouraging. They're being clever about it, Jennifer explained over the phone. HOAs have broad authority to implement fees for different property uses. If they can argue this is about commercial activity, even though it's clearly not, they might be able to make it stick legally. Fighting it would mean a lawsuit, which gets expensive fast. So I either pay $100 a month for the privilege of volunteering, or I stop volunteering. Or you move. Can't afford to right now, Jennifer sighed. Then you've got a choice to make. I'm sorry, Ryan. Sometimes the law protects people who absolutely shouldn't be in positions of authority. I talked it over with Tom and the other firefighters. The consensus was that I shouldn't pay. If I capitulated, it set a precedent that HOAs could charge volunteers for emergency service work. That could spread to other developments, create a chilling effect on volunteer recruitment. We'll cover any fees if it comes to that, Tom offered. The company can pay your HOA thing. No, I said. That's exactly what she wants. Some kind of payment that legitimizes her authority to interfere with emergency services. I won't give her that. So I didn't pay. June passed into July and my fines mounted. Between the original violations, the late fees, and now the new monthly charges for commercial use, I supposedly owed the HOA nearly $1,500. Then Patricia made her biggest mistake. On July 15th, I received another certified letter. This one informed me that due to my continued refusal to comply with community standards and pay assessed fees, the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA board had voted to revoke my access to community-provided services until all outstanding balances were resolved. I assumed this meant the pool and playground again, which I still didn't care about. But the letter included a specific provision I almost missed. Residents in arrears were not entitled to HOA-coordinated emergency services, including the community's contract with a private security company and fire safety coordination services. I read that last part several times, confused. Sunset Ridge didn't have private fire service. We were covered by Meadowbrook Fire Company like everyone else in the area. What exactly was Patricia claiming to withhold? Then I remembered. The HOA technically owned several common areas, including the community center, the pool house, and a large storage shed near the retention pond where they kept maintenance equipment. Those structures sat on HOA property, not county land. I called Tom immediately. Can an HOA refuse fire service? What? No, emergency services aren't optional. Why? I explained the letter. Tom went quiet for a long moment. That's insane, he finally said. They can't opt out of fire protection. It's not a subscription service. But if they're claiming their property isn't eligible for response, we're still responding. We have mutual aid agreements and county regulations requiring us to respond to any structure fire in our jurisdiction. This isn't legal, Ryan. I know it's not legal, but she's saying it anyway. Let me call Bob Chen again. This has gone too far. Bob Chen agreed it had gone too far. He scheduled a meeting with Patricia and the HOA board for late July to explain, presumably in small words, that emergency services don't work on an opt-in basis. But scheduling conflicts pushed the meeting back, and then Bob got called away to deal with a serious inspection issue at a commercial facility in another township. The meeting was rescheduled for mid-August. In the meantime, I kept getting violation notices. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. I'd left my garage door open past 9 p.m. There were tire marks on my driveway that constituted unsightly staining. Patricia was systematically documenting every possible infraction, real or imagined, building her case that I was some kind of problem resident who needed to be dealt with harshly. Other neighbors started approaching me quietly, expressing support but unwilling to speak up publicly. Most were afraid of becoming Patricia's next target. A few suggested I just pay the fees and move on. One older couple mentioned they were considering selling specifically because the HOA had become so aggressive under Patricia's leadership. She's driving people out, Susan told me when we ran into each other at the grocery store in early August. 3 families have sold in the past year. Everyone's afraid to say anything because she'll find some reason to fine you into oblivion. Why doesn't someone run against her? I asked. Elections are coming up, right? They're in November. And yes, someone should run, but she controls the board completely. Her friends are all on it. The election process is technically open, but Susan shrugged helplessly. But she'll make life hell for anyone who challenges her. Exactly. I seriously considered moving. Started looking at apartments, running numbers, trying to figure out if I could afford to sell at a loss and rent somewhere cheaper. The stress was affecting my work. I was short-tempered on job sites, distracted, not sleeping well. Then Jake reminded me about the August training exercise. Every summer, Meadowbrook Fire Company conducted a live burn training. We'd find a structure scheduled for demolition, get permission from the owner, and use it for controlled fire exercises. It was invaluable training, letting newer volunteers experience real structure fires under supervised conditions. This year's burn was scheduled for August 20th, and we'd lined up an old farmhouse about 3 miles from Sunset Ridge. The owner was planning to redevelop the land and was happy to let us burn the existing structure for practice. I needed that training, needed to remember why I did this work, reconnect with the purpose that made all of Patricia's nonsense worth enduring. The training went well. We spent 6 hours running various scenarios, practicing forcible entry, advancing hose lines, coordinating ventilation. By late afternoon, I felt human again, centered in a way I hadn't been in months. My pager went off at 6:30 p.m., just as we were finishing cleanup from the exercise. Structure fire, residential neighborhood, Sunset Ridge Estates. My stomach dropped. I ran for my truck along with Jake and 4 others who'd been at the training. Tom was already en route from his house. We converged on the fire station, grabbed our gear, and loaded onto Engine 3. The station was only about 10 minutes from Sunset Ridge. Dispatch provided more details as we rolled. The fire was at the HOA maintenance shed near the retention pond. Someone had reported heavy smoke visible from the main road. "That's HOA property," Jake said, making the connection immediately. The place, they said, wasn't covered for service. "We're still responding," Tom said firmly from the driver's seat. "That's not how this works." We arrived to find the storage shed fully involved. Flames poured from the roof and all 4 walls, creating a column of black smoke visible across the neighborhood. A crowd of residents had gathered at a safe distance, including Patricia, who stood near the community center with her phone raised, recording. The shed wasn't huge, maybe 20 by 30 feet, but it was packed with expensive maintenance equipment. Riding mowers, blowers, hand tools, paint, fertilizer, and according to the HOA's own inventory I'd seen posted once, nearly $40,000 worth of gear and supplies. It was also about 50 feet from the nearest house and 100 feet from the community center. If the wind shifted or burning debris spread, we could be looking at a major incident. Tom assessed the situation in seconds. "Defensive operations only. That shed's gone. We contain and protect the exposures. Jake, get a line on the community center. Ryan, you take the house exposure. Let's move." We worked fast. The shed burned hot, fueled by gasoline in the mowers and various chemicals stored inside. I focused on keeping water between the fire and the nearest house, protecting the vinyl siding already starting to warp from the radiant heat. Jake did the same for the community center. It took about 40 minutes to knock down the main body of fire and another 30 to completely extinguish it. The shed was a total loss, reduced to a collapsed pile of charred timber and melted metal. But we'd saved both the community center and the surrounding houses. As we were packing up, Patricia approached. I was coiling hose, exhausted and filthy, not in the mood for conversation. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot. I looked up. Most of my crew was still working, but a few had noticed Patricia's approach and were watching. "Yes," I kept coiling the hose. "I need to inform you that the HOA will not be covering any costs associated with this response." I straightened up slowly. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your services were not requested by the association. As per our letter from July, properties with outstanding fee obligations are not covered under Community Emergency Service Coordination." Jake had stopped working and was staring at Patricia like she'd grown a second head. "Madam," Tom said, walking over with the calm tone of someone explaining things to a particularly difficult child, "emergency fire response isn't optional or fee-based. We're a volunteer company funded by county taxes and donations. There's no bill." "Nevertheless," Patricia said, "the association questions whether this response was necessary or appropriate given that the structure was already a total loss." "It was necessary," Tom said, his calm slipping slightly, "because 50 feet that way is someone's home and 100 feet that way is your community center. We saved both." Patricia's expression didn't change. "The board will be reviewing the incident. We may file a complaint about response procedures." She walked away before anyone could respond. "Did that actually just happen?" Jake asked. "Oh, it happened." I resumed coiling the hose, my hands shaking with anger. She just threatened to file a complaint because we put out a fire on her property. Jake seemed to search for words. That's insane. That's actually insane. Tom was already on his phone, calling Bob Chen again. This had to be the final straw. You couldn't threaten fire departments for responding to emergencies, even if you were an HOA president on a power trip. But as we drove back to the station, I couldn't shake a nagging thought. Patricia had been very calm, very prepared with that statement. Almost like she'd been expecting the fire. Like she'd had her response planned in advance. The fire marshal's investigation began the next morning. Bob Chen showed up at the shed site with a deputy and spent several hours sifting through the debris. I wasn't involved in the investigation, being too close to the situation, but Tom kept me updated. Bob thinks it was arson, Tom told me on the phone that evening. The burn patterns don't match an accidental fire, and there's evidence of an accelerant, probably gasoline. My mind raced. So someone deliberately burned down the HOA shed. Looks that way. The state police are getting involved. This is going to be a criminal investigation now. I felt sick. Patricia's going to blame me. She's going to say I did it out of revenge. Did you? Of course not. I was at the training burn all afternoon. At least a dozen people can confirm that. Then you've got nothing to worry about. Let them investigate. But I was worried. Patricia had been systematically building a narrative for months. I was a problem resident, refusing to follow rules, nursing a grudge against the HOA. Now the HOA's property had burned under suspicious circumstances. Even with an alibi, it looked bad. The state police detective assigned to the case, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Kowalski, interviewed me 3 days after the fire. We met at the station, with Jennifer Park present as my attorney. Detective Kowalski was professional and thorough. She asked about my whereabouts on the 20th, my relationship with the HOA, the ongoing dispute with Patricia. I answered honestly, provided names of everyone who could confirm my presence at the training burn all day. Mr. Zimmerman, Detective Kowalski said, reviewing her notes, I'll be frank with you. On paper, you have motive. The HOA president has been, by all accounts, making your life difficult for months. Their property burns down. It looks suspicious. I understand that, I said. But I didn't do it. I wouldn't do that. Your alibi checks out. We've confirmed you were at the training exercise until at least 6 p.m. and the fire was reported at 6:30. Timeline doesn't really work for you to have said it. She paused. But I need to ask. Do you know anyone else who might have a grudge against this HOA? Anyone else who might want to send a message? I thought about that. Honestly, detective, half the neighborhood probably has a grudge against Patricia specifically. She's made a lot of enemies. But I don't know anyone who'd commit arson over it. What about other volunteers at the fire company? Anyone particularly angry on your behalf? No. We're frustrated by the situation, but nobody's that crazy. Detective Kowalski nodded, making notes. Okay. We'll be in touch if we have more questions. Don't leave the area without notifying me. After she left, Jennifer turned to me. You're not in serious trouble yet, but this is bad, Ryan. Even if they don't charge you, the suspicion alone could be damaging. I know. Have you thought about just paying the HOA fees? Ending this before it gets worse? I had thought about it. Almost constantly. But something in me rebelled at the idea of giving Patricia that victory, of legitimizing her abuse of authority by capitulating. Not yet, I said. The investigation continued through late August. Detective Kowalski interviewed numerous residents, reviewed security camera footage from nearby houses, and conducted a detailed forensic analysis of the shed remains. The state fire marshal confirmed the presence of gasoline as an accelerant, poured in multiple locations inside the shed before ignition. Someone had deliberately and methodically burned down that building. On September 3rd, Detective Kowalski made an arrest. Patricia Chambers was charged with second-degree arson and insurance fraud. The news hit Sunset Ridge like a bomb. I heard about it from Susan, who called me in a state of shock. "Ryan, turn on Channel 4. They're arresting Patricia right now." I pulled up the news stream on my phone. Sure enough, there was footage of Patricia being led from her house in handcuffs, looking outraged and indignant. The news anchor explained that the HOA president had been charged with burning down the association's own storage shed as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Further investigation revealed that Patricia had filed a claim with the HOA's insurance company for nearly $70,000, well above the actual value of the lost equipment. She'd inflated the inventory, claiming items that had never existed or had been sold off years earlier. The insurance company, suspicious of the claim, had contacted law enforcement. Detective Kowalski's investigation uncovered that Patricia had been embezzling from the HOA for at least 2 years. The special assessments, the aggressive fines, the constant fundraising, all of it had been funneling money into Patricia's pocket. She'd been covering her tracks with creative accounting, but the books were a mess. When an internal audit got scheduled for September, she'd panicked and decided to create a major insurance claim to cover the missing funds. The arson was meant to be a distraction and a payday. What Patricia hadn't counted on was the thoroughness of the investigation. Detective Kowalski found receipts from Patricia's purchase of gas cans the morning of the fire. Security footage from a gas station showed Patricia filling those cans at 3 p.m. She'd been sloppy, careless, convinced that she was above suspicion. The evidence was overwhelming. I watched the news coverage with a mix of vindication and sadness. Yes, Patricia had made my life miserable. Yes, she'd abused her authority and harassed me for months. But watching her perp walk, seeing her life implode on camera, I couldn't feel entirely good about it. She'd done it to herself, of course. But still, the HOA board, or what remained of it after 2 members resigned in disgrace, held an emergency meeting. The 3 remaining members, all of whom claimed they'd had no idea about Patricia's embezzlement, suspended all pending fines and fees while they conducted a complete audit of the association's finances. My $1,500 in supposed debts vanished overnight. Susan was appointed interim president and immediately began the work of rebuilding trust. She reached out to me personally, apologizing for not speaking up more forcefully during the dispute. "I should have done more," she said when we met for coffee. "I knew Patricia was out of control, but I was afraid of becoming a target. That was cowardly." "You spoke up when it mattered," I said. "That's more than most people did. Still, the HOA owes you an apology. All of us do." Susan pushed through a series of reforms at the next membership meeting. The board's authority to levy fines was curtailed significantly, requiring majority votes and clear evidence. Special assessments over $100 would now require full membership approval. The bylaws were amended to protect residents' rights to volunteer for emergency services, with explicit language stating that such service could never be considered commercial activity. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Patricia's trial was scheduled for early 2027, and the preliminary hearings suggested she'd likely take a plea deal rather than face a jury. The embezzlement charges alone were enough to guarantee prison time. I kept volunteering with Meadowbrook Fire Company, responding to calls without fear of HOA retaliation. My pager went off at all hours. I came and went at irregular times, and nobody said a word about it. Because that's what volunteer firefighters do, and nobody had the right to interfere with that. Jake and I were washing engine 3 after a minor car accident call one October evening when he brought up the shed fire. "You ever think about how lucky you were?" he asked. "With the timing of everything." "Lucky how?" "That you had that training burn the same day. Perfect alibi. If you'd been home alone, no witnesses, you'd have been the obvious suspect." I'd thought about that more than once. "Yeah, the timing worked out. Almost too perfectly, you know." Jake gave me a sideways look, like someone knew you needed an alibi. I stopped scrubbing and met his eyes. "What are you saying?" "Nothing. Just that the universe works in mysterious ways." He returned to his section of the engine. "Sometimes karma needs a little help, but it always catches up with people eventually." I thought about Detective Kowalski's question, the one about whether anyone else might have wanted to send the HOA a message. I thought about the training burn location, chosen months in advance, about the timing of the shed fire, right at the end of our exercise, about how fire investigations work, and what patterns experienced firefighters would know to avoid or create. But mostly, I thought about how Patricia had done this to herself. She'd embezzled money, committed fraud, literally burned down property for an insurance payout. Whatever investigation came after, whatever suspicions might linger, the evidence showed Patricia's guilt beyond question. "Yeah," I said finally, returning to the engine. "Karma does catch up." The months following Patricia's arrest brought significant changes to Sunset Ridge Estates. A forensic accountant brought in to review the HOA's finances discovered that Patricia had stolen over $60,000 across 2.5 years, using a combination of inflated vendor invoices, phantom maintenance expenses, and creative categorization of legitimate fees. Some of the money had funded her lifestyle, expensive vacations and purchases that her accounting job alone couldn't support. The rest had simply disappeared into personal accounts. The HOA's insurance covered some of the losses, but not all. The membership voted to pursue a civil suit against Patricia to recover the embezzled funds, though nobody expected to see much money even if they won. Patricia's assets were limited, and criminal restitution would take priority. What hurt more than the money was the breach of trust. Patricia had positioned herself as the guardian of community standards, the defender of property values, all while systematically robbing her neighbors. Every aggressive fine, every harsh enforcement action, every sanctimonious lecture about community responsibility had been coming from someone actively stealing from the people she claimed to serve. I attended the November HOA meeting, the first election since Patricia's arrest. Susan had agreed to run for president officially, and 2 other longtime residents stepped up for the vacant board seats. For the first time in years, the meeting felt hopeful rather than adversarial. Susan won the presidency unanimously. Her first act was to formally apologize to me in front of the entire membership. "Ryan Zimmerman has served this community as a volunteer firefighter for years," she said from the front of the room. "He's responded to emergencies, protected property, potentially saved lives. And instead of thanking him, our previous leadership harassed him, fined him, and tried to prevent him from serving. That was wrong. On behalf of this HOA, I apologize." The membership applauded. Several people came up to shake my hand afterward, offering their own apologies and thanks. It felt good, I'll admit, but also somewhat hollow. The damage had been done. Patricia had poisoned the well, and it would take a long time to restore the sense of community that should have existed. Still, it was a start. Bob Chen finally held his long-delayed meeting with the new HOA board in December, explaining in detail how emergency services work, and why HOAs have no authority to interfere with volunteer firefighters. It was largely unnecessary at that point, but Bob wanted it on the official record. For future boards, he explained to me afterward. So if someone else gets the wrong idea 10 years from now, there's documentation showing this issue was addressed. Patricia's criminal case moved through the system faster than expected. Facing overwhelming evidence, she accepted a plea deal in January. She pleaded guilty to second-degree arson, insurance fraud, and 3 counts of theft by unlawful taking. The sentence was harsh: 4 to 8 years in state prison, 5 years probation after release, and full restitution of the embezzled funds plus the fraudulent insurance claim. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing, but Susan did. She called me afterward. She didn't show any remorse, Susan said, sounding tired. She gave this whole statement about how she'd been trying to protect property values and got overwhelmed by the pressure, made herself out to be the victim. Of course she did. The judge wasn't buying it. He was pretty harsh, actually. Said that people in positions of trust who abuse that trust deserve the full weight of the law. Good. Yeah, Susan paused. I know she made your life hell, Ryan, but part of me feels bad for her. Her whole life is ruined now. Her job, her reputation, her freedom, all gone. I understood what Susan meant. It was possible to acknowledge that someone had faced consequences for their actions while still recognizing the human tragedy of watching a life implode. Patricia had been wrong, had committed serious crimes, and deserved punishment. But she was still a person, and her fall had been spectacular and complete. She did it to herself, I said, which was true but felt inadequate. I know. I just keep thinking about how many chances she had to stop, to back down, to take a different path. She chose this at every turn. That was the real lesson in all of this. Patricia had options at every stage. She could have accepted being questioned at the March meeting, could have backed down from the harassment campaign, could have stopped embezzling and come clean. Instead, she doubled down every time, escalating until the only way out she could see was arson and fraud. Pride and ego had destroyed her more surely than any external force. Life gradually returned to normal. I kept working as an electrician, kept volunteering with the fire company, kept living in my house in Sunset Ridge Estates. The HOA became what it should have been from the start. A relatively boring administrative body that maintained common areas and enforced reasonable standards without drama or harassment. Susan proved to be an excellent president. She was organized without being controlling, firm without being aggressive. Under her leadership, the HOA actually functioned as a community organization rather than a petty fiefdom. Property values stabilized and even started to increase as word spread that the toxic leadership was gone. Jake and I never spoke again about his cryptic comments regarding the timing of the shed fire. There was nothing to discuss, really. The investigation had concluded, Patricia had been convicted, and the case was closed. Any speculation about deeper involvement or alternative theories was just that, speculation. What mattered was that justice had been served, even if the path to that justice had been complicated and messy. On a quiet evening in March, almost exactly a year after the dispute began, I sat on my front porch watching the sunset. My pager sat on the table beside me, ready to sound off if needed. My truck, with its volunteer firefighter plates and emergency lights, stood openly in my driveway. No violation notices would be coming, no harassment over my service. Tom called while I was sitting there, checking in as he sometimes did. "How you doing, Ryan?" he asked. "Everything settled down?" "Yeah, finally. HOA's functioning normally now. Susan's doing a good job." "Good." "You had one hell of a year." That's an understatement. You ever think about moving, getting out of there? I'd thought about it. But somewhere along the way, Sunset Ridge had stopped feeling like enemy territory. My neighbors, the ones who'd been too afraid to speak up before, had become friendly and supportive. The community, freed from Patricia's toxic influence, was actually pleasant to live in. "No," I said. "I think I'll stay. This is home now, even after everything that happened." Especially after everything that happened. Someone's got to stick around to make sure the next HOA president doesn't get any crazy ideas. Tom laughed. "Fair enough. Listen, we've got the spring training schedule coming up. You available for the first aid recertification next month?" "Absolutely." "Send me the details." We talked for a few more minutes about department business, upcoming calls, and general gossip. Just normal volunteer firefighter conversation, the kind I'd had hundreds of times before. But it felt significant somehow, a marker that things had truly returned to normal. After hanging up, I stayed on the porch for a while longer, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Lights came on in houses up and down the street. A couple walked their dog past my house, waving hello. A few houses down, kids played basketball in a driveway, their shouts carrying on the cooling air. This was what community was supposed to look like. Not perfectly manicured lawns enforced by harassment, not rigid compliance with arbitrary rules, but actual people living their lives together with basic mutual respect. It had taken a disaster to get here, but we'd arrived. My pager went off at 8:15. Kitchen fire, residential, about 2 miles away. I grabbed my gear and headed for the truck, already running through mental checklists. Behind me, I heard a neighbor shout good luck. Down the street, someone else raised a hand in acknowledgement as I pulled out. The fire turned out to be minor, a grease fire in a pan that had gotten out of hand before we arrived. The homeowner, an elderly man living alone, was shaken but uninjured. His kitchen had some smoke and heat damage, but the fire hadn't spread beyond the stove area. We ventilated the house, made sure there were no hidden hot spots, and ensured the man had somewhere to stay while his kitchen was being repaired. "Thank you," he said as we were packing up. "I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't come so fast." "That's what we're here for," I told him. "You did the right thing calling 911. Driving back to the station afterward, I thought about that thank you. That's what the past year had really been about. Not HOA politics or personal grudges or even justice for Patricia's crimes. It had been about protecting the ability to help people, to respond when called, to serve the community in the way that mattered most. Patricia had tried to take that away over ego and pride, over being questioned and challenged. She'd weaponized her authority to punish someone for speaking up, and in doing so, she'd crossed a line that led inevitably to her destruction. The arson and fraud were just symptoms of a deeper problem, the belief that power existed for personal benefit rather than community service. Back at the station, Jake and the others were already cleaning equipment and filing paperwork. I joined them, settling into the familiar rhythms of volunteer work. This was where I belonged, doing work that mattered alongside people who understood service. "Good call tonight," Tom said, reviewing my incident report. "Quick response, good outcome. Exactly how it's supposed to work." "Yeah," I agreed. "Exactly how it's supposed to work." The HOA never filed any formal complaints about my firefighting service again. The new board even sent a letter to the fire company in April, thanking all volunteers from Sunset Ridge Estates for their service and expressing the community's support. It was a small gesture, but meaningful. Susan framed the letter and hung it in the community center, right next to the new rules and bylaws. A reminder of what had been learned, what had changed, and what the community stood for going forward. I ran into Detective Kowalski once more, several months after Patricia's sentencing. I was grabbing coffee at a diner outside town when she walked in, spotted me, and came over. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, "mind if I sit for a minute?" "Sure, detective." She ordered coffee and settled into the booth across from me. We made small talk for a few minutes about nothing in particular. Then she got to what seemed like her real purpose. "That case with your HOA president," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I've been doing this job for 18 years, and that was one of the stranger ones." "How so?" "The way everything lined up. The embezzlement, the fraud, the arson. And the timing, with you having a perfect alibi right when you needed it." She met my eyes. "Almost too convenient, you know." My heart rate picked up slightly, but I kept my expression neutral. "Lucky timing." "Yeah, lucky." She took a sip of coffee. "The thing about investigations is, sometimes you know there's more to a story than what the evidence shows. You get a feeling, an intuition, but feelings don't hold up in court. Evidence does." "I suppose that's true." The evidence in this case was clear. Patricia Chambers committed arson and fraud. She embezzled money from her HOA. She's serving time for those crimes. The case is closed. But the case is closed." She stood up, leaving money on the table for her coffee. "I just wanted you to know that I recognize good people when I meet them. People who serve their communities, who do the right thing even when it's hard. Those people deserve protection." She walked out without waiting for a response, leaving me sitting in the booth with my thoughts racing. What exactly had she been saying? That she suspected something but wasn't pursuing it? That she knew something but had chosen to let it go? Or just that she appreciated volunteer firefighters and wanted to say so? I'd never know for certain, and that was probably for the best. Life continued. Seasons changed, calls came and went, and Sunset Ridge Estates became just a normal neighborhood with normal HOA concerns. Susan served 2 years as president before passing the torch to another resident. The board remained stable and reasonable. Property values did fine. I dated a woman named Gina for a while, a teacher I met through mutual friends. She lived outside the HOA and found my stories about Patricia's downfall both horrifying and darkly entertaining. "I can't imagine being that obsessed with controlling people," Gina said one evening as we made dinner together in my kitchen. "What do you even get out of it? A sense of power, I guess. Being able to make people do what you want or punish them when they don't. Sounds exhausting." It probably was. Gina and I eventually broke up, friendly and amicable, both recognizing we wanted different things. But her observation stuck with me. Patricia's crusade against me, her escalating harassment and abuse of authority, had required enormous energy and effort. She'd spent months building cases against me, documenting violations, preparing presentations and letters. All that time and energy devoted to punishing someone for embarrassing her at a meeting. What could she have accomplished if she'd channeled that drive into something productive? If she'd worked to genuinely improve the community, to solve real problems, to bring people together rather than terrorizing them into compliance. But that wasn't who Patricia was. She'd needed enemies and targets, needed people to dominate and control. The embezzlement had probably started as a way to fund her lifestyle, but it had also been an expression of entitlement. She'd believed the HOA was hers to exploit, that her position gave her rights rather than responsibilities. In the end, that belief had destroyed her completely. I thought about writing her a letter once, during one of those strange late-night moments when questionable ideas seem profound. Not to gloat or condemn, but maybe to offer some kind of perspective or closure. But what would I even say? That I hoped she was learning something from her incarceration. That I forgave her, even though she'd never apologized. That in some twisted way, her harassment had made me more committed to volunteer service than ever. I never wrote the letter. Some things didn't need to be said, and Patricia Chambers was no longer my concern. She was serving her time, hopefully reflecting on her choices, and whatever healing or growth she might experience was between her and herself. My focus was on moving forward, on being the kind of person who served the community rather than exploited it. Every call I responded to, every fire I helped extinguish, every person I helped in an emergency was a repudiation of everything Patricia had represented: service over selfishness, community over control, responsibility over entitlement. Those were the values that mattered, the principles worth defending even against HOA harassment and legal threats. Patricia had tried to corrupt those values, to turn volunteer,